I wanted to kind of start logically at the beginning. I know that the book kind of came out of a short story that you published in the Kenyon Review called Grand Mall. And I was curious, sort of what in that short story seemed like a seed for a novel, and how did you expand it into this very layered narrative?
Great question. So now I feel so conscious talking into the microphone. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Malaprops. This is this is the platonic ideal bookstore of my youth, is what I always say. This was like my dream of what the perfect bookstore should be. So it's lovely to be back here, and full circle moment. Yeah. So I wrote a story called Grand Mall, and you will, if you so choose to read this book, you'll see a version of it that kind of becomes the first full chapter. And it was a story that actually I can shout out. Where did Alice go? So Alice, although I realized later that it was actually Alice's younger sister, I think, who gave this kernel at some point in college. And I'll say that I have 3 of my college housemates here. At some point, Alice told me about this thing that her sister had said, and it was sort of a kernel of advice she had heard that was, if you're ever being attacked, you should basically fall to the ground and throw a kind of fit, like be it a medical fit, a medical event, a demon attack. Like, it doesn't really matter, but you should do something so strange and so bizarre that the person trying to attack you is like, this is not worth my time. I've got to flee. And so I was always struck by that little kernel, A, because I wondered if it would actually work, and B, because I thought it was so strange that even there at Chapel Hill, this public institution, this sort of place governed by a mission of idealism, and this place of educating youths from all over North Carolina, I thought, isn't it strange that this is the kind of thing that young women are still walking around thinking about? And so it was out of that the story kind of emerged. And I'm really interested in stories about absence. I'm really interested in people being haunted, if not by ghosts, but by people who impacted them even in their absence. I was really interested in the idea of a woman in middle age at sort of a point of pivoting in her life, feeling jealous of a young woman who had died. So it's like she actually is the lucky one. She's living, and yet there's this way that this person tragically lost in her youth is sort of remains crystallized in this state of kind of perfection that she is jealous of, and that, oh, this is all such rich territory for a story. And then after I wrote this story, I thought, this is a world I could hang out in. Like that, I didn't even think of it as a novel at that point, because that seemed far too daunting for me to fathom. But I thought, what about the ripple effect of this? And it's very much, as you'll see, it's very much kind of a project that is looking at ripple effects. And so I thought, what about all the people, this kind of long shadow or this void, and the way it becomes this kind of echo chamber. Her death is this echo chamber into which all these people are telling stories, trying to understand. And I thought, I could spin something out from that. I could think of a lot of people who would have been even glancingly touched by that. Did I answer the question?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I wanted to talk more about that idea in a minute, this psychology of a town and a community, but I was wondering if you could read a little bit from the beginning.
I would love to. I may put the microphone down now, since we know it works both ways. And the moment I try to read in public, my mouth just produces 0 saliva. So this will help. Joy's freshman roommate claimed that if you were being attacked, you had to throw a fit, fall to the ground, froth at the mouth, growl, fling your arms, spout gibberish. Carly demonstrated vividly, and with an ease that suggested she'd previously employed such a tactic successfully. She looked like a holy roller, someone in the grip of ecstatic revelation. nothing like an actual epileptic. Joy knew because her father suffered from epilepsy. But an attacker would hardly know the difference, Carly promised. The exact details wouldn't matter, so go bananas with it. Vomit if you're able, let your eyes roll back in your head. The attacker would be so startled, so wary of whatever dread affliction or malevolent spirit had seized you that he'd scamper off harmless into the shadows. In another of Joy's most vivid memories of her, Carly presided over a group of their dorm mates passing out piping hot break and bake cookies straight from the toaster oven, along with a hand-annotated chapter summaries printed from a book called I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Do you all remember this book? Children of the late 90s. I Kissed Dating Goodbye. The girls, glossy-haired and chirruping, like a cluster of morning songbirds, sat cross-legged atop her lofted bed, sprawled across her lavender comforter. They perched on her desk or straddled her desk chair. Cooing abundantly, they filled the room with soft exhalations and murmurs of assent. Their sweet breath, thank you. Okay. Their sweet breath combined with the scent of fresh baked cookies, mango body lotion, and tropical fruit hair conditioner to turn the air madly, clashingly fragrant, like that in a fine lady's boutique. Carly, her very name like a filigreed pink greeting card, was leading a small group derived from a large all-campus evangelical organization. She had a way of noticing the friendless and ushering them toward her, cultivating some secret specialness they each possessed until it bloomed. Already at age 18, she held herself with an unflappable maternal authority. Even then, as it was happening, this was a scene at which Joy could gaze but never truly enter. Stuck outside, little match girl style, her fingers icy against the metaphorical glass of a specific sort of faith or lack thereof that blocked true access. Joy had a chemistry exam looming. She was the sort of girl who took looming chemistry exams seriously. There was no space for her seriousness, her worldly anxieties there in her own blessed dorm room. She would have to trudge back to the library, but not before her roommate paused and smiled. Carly knew her type and pitied her, handing Joy a cookie for her troubles. Even in this dismissal, Joy glowed with a sanctified warmth. Everyone was a bit more radiant in Carly's presence, and Joy was not immune. This moment occurred, of course, before Carly went through a phase of rebellion, a personal rumspringa during which she discovered drinking and the fact that blowjob did not mean blowing gently against the nether regions of a person you love. Those were the innocent early days when she still used terms like front bottom instead of vagina and collected lip balms flavored like pineapple soda and endorsed books that argued godly young women should refrain from kissing anyone until their wedding day. Submission to the right sort of authority, Carly said, was glorious, liberating even. It was a doublespeak so calm, so self-assured that Joy envied her certitude. Despite all this, Carly possessed a brutal practicality. While her providential faith armed her with untroubled optimism in many respects, God would guide her through the Spanish quiz she hadn't studied for, she had an array of strategies when it came to certain exigencies. She was a collector of tips gleaned from Oprah, ways to jab a pickpocket in the throat or how to escape from a trunk in the event of a carjacking. She could change a flat in the time it took AAA to show up. She could remove a stain from white linen with her own spit. God would nod approvingly. She was prepared. Pink mace, a dainty purse-sized first aid kit, double-sided tape to secure a bra strap, emergency tampons, granola bars, a Swiss Army knife. Not 2 years after she and Joy first met, Carly was dead.
I was so hoping you would stop there.
That was always the part where I stopped.
Slam it shut. I think I texted you when I first read this page and I said you should have put a trigger warning before I kissed dating goodbye, because if you know, you know. That was a dark period.
Wasn't
It was dark.
Yeah.
The main difference I noticed between this story as it was published in the Kenyon Review and it as it appears in the novel is obviously the perspective change from first person to third,
Yeah.
which you obviously had to do because of the various perspectives that you weave throughout the book. I was wondering if you could talk about sort of how you laid out those different character threads, if there was any that you particularly enjoyed or didn't enjoy writing.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, it was something I thought about. You know, I've heard people say, I've heard certain short story writers in particular say that there's something very intuitive about the first person short story, and I think that that makes a lot of sense, that you sort of are, you know, popping right in behind the eyeballs of the character and writing with that eye, and that very much was how I wrote it. And I pondered, you know, it could have been, Joy is still kind of a load-bearing column. She's kind of a through line in the story, but it's very much a sort of polyvocal, prismatic is the word that my agent used for it. Story where like she keeps coming back, but it very much is giving other people's eyeballs a chance to you know, be looked out through. And I think I thought fairly quickly, I thought, you know, I think it may be better if I'm doing essentially like a close third. So in each of the sections, like you are sort of dropping into the, you know, craniums of these different people, and it is very much a close third, which is a lot of fun to do as a writer. But for some reason, you know, doing that felt more intuitive when I was shifting around than sticking with the eye. And I had a great time. And the thing that I'll say, the thing that I love the most, we could talk about me, it's why I'm a psychiatrist, I don't know. The thing that I love the most, well, I don't believe in bad guys, I'll say that first, but like for lack of a better term, I really like getting into the heads of what might be called bad guys. For example, there is, if you've not yet read it, and I hope you might, if you've not yet read it, there is there's a professor, he's a wonderful professor. I just love him. I love him so much. He's not really like a, you know, exemplar of maybe how one ought to be as a, like if anybody in the room is a teacher or a professor, I wouldn't model my, I wouldn't model myself after him. But like so Jacob, like he was so fun to write, but part of it I think, and I think I've heard other people talk about that too, it's like the beauty of fiction for me is that sort of like trying to figure out how people understand themselves, how do they justify themselves, how do they see themselves. I also think like I can't write that person sort of sitting down and seeing him with judgment. I sort of have to find kind of love and compassion for him and all of his like flawed complexity. And so those were the ones. I won't say who the person who did it. You will. It is not a traditional mystery story, I wouldn't say, but you do. I did want people to still get the satisfaction of finding out who done it, and so you do find out who did the deed. But even that was sort of like a kind of a brutal part to write, to sort of like be in that person's distress and consternation and sort of how that happened. But that was a lot of fun to write too. So I don't know what that says about me, that I really enjoyed the ne'er-do-wells, but yeah, I'm a law-abiding citizen really for the most part. So maybe that's why.
I mean, you brought up the psychiatry part, so I'm going to pick that up. Joanna and I are both psychiatrists. I do think there's something in how you were talking just now about how it is to be with patients, that like non-judgmental attentiveness that I really felt in the book as well. One thing that I thought that did for me is it sort of de-sanctified, that's the word that I'm going to use, the Carly, who ends up being, you know, it's very clear from the very beginning that she's murdered. there is this trope, you know, of these young women who are killed, who become these sort of figures of innocence. And I liked the way the book really complicated that, and was curious if that was like part of the intention of the multiple perspectives as well.
Yeah, no, you're a total genius, as I already knew, but you're as a genius question. Exactly. I mean, I think that yeah, I mean, I've in so many ways I was knowingly working with tropes, be they tropes of mystery, tropes of true crime, tropes of sort of that the hallowed, sanctified, often it is a young, beautiful white woman in these cases. I mean, there is something about that that's kind of like deeply interesting, apparently, in our culture, in all of the ways that it's kind of like complicated and probably and still quite tragic. So yeah, I was thinking about that. I was thinking about books haunted by a central absence. So I go to what I think of as like the OG of those books, and probably a lot of y'all have read or seen a movie version of Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. Probably a lot of you, yeah. So I mean, I think that to me, it's such a wonderful story, because the whole first however much, this person's never on the page, but she looms large in her kind of like mythologized, daunting self. And then later, when you sort of, in this wonderful kind of reversal, when you realize the reality of the situation, it's far different. And I thought like that was something that I very much wanted to do, is have both the sort of like Carly as legend and all of the ways that like legend and sort of our desire for narrative sense making and kind of belief, be that like, you know, capital B belief in the form of organized religion, or like belief on like Reddit threads and urban legend. I was interested in the ways that absence sort of shaped storytelling. And then I thought, well, it's only fair that then like, let's come back and get to see her as a flesh and blood, flawed, real 19-year-old. And I liked that idea of like, you know, getting both. I also like to flip it around. I'll say I also liked the idea that Joy, who is Carly's roommate, who lives on into adulthood and sort of gets prompted to look into this. I also liked the idea that like Joy gets seen through other people's eyes. I like the idea that in a way that the gaze always gets to shift, and you sort of get to see people as they understand the world, and then how they're being understood. Because that's one of the things I find so interesting as a psychiatrist, is like the interestingness and also the limitations of our own perspectives, and like how we're kind of locked into our own little, you know, how was that as a good ramble?
That was great. You did mention the Reddit kind of content, which is a whole other set of perspectives. So throughout the book, there's these chapters that are narrated by third person close. What did you call it?
Yeah, close third.
Close third, yeah. But then there's also interspersed this kind of internet detritus almost.
Yes, yeah.
It's like there are some Reddit threads, there's obituaries, there's a poem at the end, which I want to talk about with you. So can you talk more about including that? Because it also acts like a second level commentary on the plot, which I thought was very interesting.
I think you've asked the question again brilliantly. Yeah. You know, like many things, I think when you set out to do a creative project, I think often it starts as just like fun and your instinct, you know, and I thought like, oh, it's going to be so fun. I'm going to, I think I probably read some books that used interstitial, you know, like documentary evidence kind of. And I thought, well, this is fiction, but won't it be fun if I have these kind of like interstitial text? And then I thought, you know, in a way it's also kind of operating as a sort of Greek chorus. And in the way of like all of our modern Greek choruses, there's true stuff, like there's stuff that they're saying that I think ends up being accurate to the story, and then there's all sorts of just pure detritus. And so I liked that idea of you know, art mimicking life, but I also just liked, I mean, I think this sounds very grand, but I think it is, because I think of it as as a story about how we tell story. It's like how like something like this happens, we seek to understand it. Often as we seek to understand it, we're also often trying to understand something about ourselves. And I feel like that in a lot of ways is how these interstitial documents are working. It's like people trying, sometimes successfully, sometimes they're just like posting, you know, garbage. It's because this is the thing, I don't know if y'all have, like, some of the stuff on the internet is not true, as it turns out. So yeah, so like I like it started as fun, and then I felt like it was sort of like conceptually in line with the project. And then to go back to the psychiatry thing, I think that like the moments where you're actually in chapter with a person, I think of that as at least for a moment, and yes, it's limited by like what their eyeballs see, but I think of that as like getting in the room with the person. Because the thing that I've always found in my day job, and I wonder if this is true for you, in glancing interactions with people can be very difficult to connect with or annoying, or they can like leave a sassy message and like you're kind of like, but like 99 point something% of the time, if given the opportunity to like be in the room with them, talking to them, you often do find a place of sort of more understanding and more, I don't know, yeah, empathy is the only word that I keep coming back to, but yeah, so that's my answer to that.
No, I definitely identify with that. I think that's probably my favorite part about our job. And I'd love to hear that that has kind of informed your writings. I don't write fiction. I feel qualified to sit here because you and I have texted about the Murdaugh trials endlessly, but otherwise, so I love to hear that that's kind of informed the way you're viewing your characters. I think that's beautiful. The other effect I noticed with all the different voices, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, is this sort of psychology of a community, particularly UNC, where you went to school. I imagine that it was fun in some ways to write a book set in this place you know really well, but also probably kind of complicated. And so I was curious about that experience for you.
Yeah, it was fun and complicated. Yeah, it's well, it's also fun to have a couple of faces that I lit. Like, it's funny now, these days, I drive by this really, I don't think they've, you know, done any work on this house since we were living in it in the early 2000s. Like, truly, I think it's still untouched. But I drive by the college house that I used to live in, you know, decades ago, and I live there now. And so it is funny that like Chapel Hill Carborough has this kind of palimpsest quality for me, where it's like it's the same place, but like there's a layer that was the past, and then I had a long decade away, and then now I come back and I live in it as a middle-aged lady driving kids, or like it's just like a very different like mode of life, and yet it's the same. And like every now and then I'll see like the bike path where I toppled over. I don't know. It's a strange kind of collision of past and present. And I think that structurally this book has sort of that like double layer, past and present. They're two chunks. There's a sort of 2019 chunk and then a late 90s chunk. And so it itself has that that quality. It was very fun. And I think we were talking about this earlier, I think Tara and Alice and I think that there have been, and it's not unique to UNC, of course, but like as a community, there've been at least, you know, 3 notably haunting, very tragic murders that I was, you know, bumped around in my mind as things that kind of haunted me, and I thought about, you know, and I'm sure that there are more that I'm not thinking of. I'm thinking of kind of like the one in the 70s in the Arboretum, and then in the early 2008, 2012. I think that those cast a long shadow, and I think that people feel that and think about it. I was very, very, very wary of not writing a fictional version of any of those specific stories. And so I think like very quickly people say, oh, is it based on a true event? I would say, no, no, no. And it's definitely not. I mean, you read it, it's not based on a specific event, except insofar as we are all haunted by those specific events. So I think that probably people who have who are either alums of UNC or from North Carolina, I think you can't not read these kind of stories with those real events sort of like living in the shadows a little bit. And so my only hope there is like, other than hoping I get like details of Chapel Hill, right? And it's fake, it's real and imagined, Chapel Hill and real and imagined North Carolina. But I think my big hope is that because there are real things that lurk in the periphery, I hope that it's handled with its due kind of complexity and consideration. I think that feels like this sort of burden. It would have been more burdensome if I were trying to write something more direct, I think, but I think even now I feel like I hope that it's given its due complicatedness. I don't know if that's a word. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. I think, there were these touch points, like locations, parties you wrote about that I was like, did Joanna go to a Y2K party in her youth? That felt very real. And I was wondering, do you want to read a little bit from that section?
Yeah, sure. Oh gosh, do I have it marked? All the other sections. Is it? Oh yeah.
So this is a Y2K themed party that Joy and several other characters attend.
Thank you for stalling.
You're welcome.
I'm just going to read from the beginning. A little bit. If the world ends when the clock strikes midnight, Joy figures she'll be here, alone in her near-empty high-rise dorm when it happens. For reasons she cannot fully explain, it feels like a punishment she probably deserves. The campus is a ghost town. Joy's sophomore roommate, Eliza, nice enough, but hardly a close friend, has gone home to Wilmington. And yet someone is knocking at her door. Joy shifts in her twin bed, neither fully awake nor asleep now, listening. The person knocks again, less hesitant, louder. In her dream, Joy was sitting on a grassy embankment near a community soccer field talking to her former best friend, Rachel, spelled differently from your name, Rachel, just in case there was any confusion. Sun-dappled Rachel, fair and freckled, throwing her head back and hiccuping laughter. Smiling Rachel, bathed in all that leafy green gold light. Rachel has vanished. The relentless knocking comes again. One must speak special dispensation from the university to stay in the dorms over the holidays, an option mostly reserved for international students. Joy is not an international. This is totally not the part that I was going to read, was it? This was the part.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
That was like a small amuse-bouche, just to get you in the dorm room spirit. Christianity is an inherently apocalyptic religion. Mainstream Christianity, with its gleaming edifices fitted with big screen TVs and coffee bars, is simply in denial. Joy knows this. She took an honors seminar last semester on apocalypticism, and before that, she'd taken Professor Hendrick's class on the Second Great Awakening and modern evangelicalism, although it was best not to think of that course or of Professor Hendricks now. Joy realizes the doomsday cults, the fringe Christians bracing for the end times, are in many ways more accurately hearing Jesus's message. There's an honesty there, a real commitment, an acknowledgement of the message most others, members of the gathering included, seem to ignore. With them, it's all about the blessings of God's bounty, new cars and job promotions, gifts doled out by a benevolent cosmic Santa Claus. In a way, it makes her respect her own father, the plainness of his vision, his practicality and asceticism, even if now it's a lapsed vision, a failure all the more. I should mention Joy's father is a pastor and going through his own crises. It is cold, dark enough to be midnight, even though it's not quite 8 p.m. And Joy is following Tatiana up the steep paved slope that separates South Campus from the rest of campus, as well as Franklin Street and downtown. Across the way, they can see lights over near Kenan Stadium. Come on, Tatiana says. She's wearing a midriff-bearing spaghetti strap sequin top despite the chill, and a grandpa sweater layered over the top, wide-leg skater jeans that may or may not still be in style, but have clearly been thoughtfully chosen. Her eyelids are a carefully applied iridescent gold. Her efforts are touching to Joy, who has made no effort at all, other than to finally put on pants and brush her teeth. No, that is a lie. Joy is wearing the most beautiful pair of panties she owns, soft and buttery, trimmed with lace. Lingerie, really. A foolish indulgence no one will likely ever see, but something that feels like a good secret. The fabric cool and promising as she pulls it up her skinny thighs. Otherwise, she is dressed like an ordinary tomboy, harmless and unassuming. Few people are going to Waffle House after, Tatiana says, her words white puffs in the cold. We're invited if we want. Maybe I'll stop there. It's a little small.
Yeah. Let's stop
Stop at the Waffle House, which is where one ought to go after the party, right?
Right. After this.
Yeah, after this.
I definitely wanted to ask you about this before we move to other questions from the folks here and virtually. There's so many themes of religion and evangelicalism in the book, very ominous, which I loved. I'm wondering if you can talk more about how that kind of came into the original short story and expanded into the novel.
Yeah, it's a great question. Maybe this has changed and maybe it hasn't. I feel like I talked to someone else about this and she agreed that she felt that it was very specific to like the late 90s, early 2000s Christian zeitgeist, that there was something very specific about a certain flavor of like Christian ska music and there was something like there was a very specific aesthetic to it. And so I think like I was thinking about that with this story and thinking about obviously that book, I guess Dating Goodbye, which was kind of that era. And I will say that in no way does this professor at all appear fictionally in this book, but there's a wonderful professor that a lot of people may have heard of because he's kind of a famous guy at this point. He writes a lot of popular books, but Bart Ehrman, did anybody take a class with him at UNC friends? He's great. Like he's like now at the level where I feel like he's on interviews with Terry Gross and whatnot. So you could probably hear him on Fresh Air, but he had these wonderful like New Testament classes where he had this incredible sort of class on the historicity of the Bible and a lot of the stuff in here about sort of what the vision actually was. And he was just like a master lecturer. It was so interesting. But then it was just like an interesting skill for him to run the class because inevitably a few times each semester, some student would feel called to rise up in the class and sort of say like, well, God has put it upon my heart in the middle of this lecture to tell you that I don't know. I don't even know what the person would say, but it would be some kind of like conflict of a specific kind of evangelical vision that the person seemed to think was in conflict with what Professor Ehrman was teaching. And he always had the most gracious yet erudite way of responding to the person. I mean, never humiliating, always respectful, always kind of coming back to like the historical facts as we know them in this like very like gracious, kind way. So I think that that's what I was thinking about. I was thinking about that kind of collision of like, I'd also, now I'm really just going deep into like what my mind was percolating in. I'd also looked at this book by a wonderful writer named Kate Bowler that some of y'all might have heard about. She's become very well known now because she's written really beautifully about her experience with colon cancer and sort of how her faith and how she's written very beautifully about that. She also at first was just an academic, and she had written on like prosperity gospel stuff, which I just think is like a very interesting, mostly American, I think. Thank you, Christian. I was like, Christian will know. I think it's a pretty American phenomenon. And so I think like, I don't think I'm making any kind of erudite point that like Christian or Bart Ehrman would be able to make, but I think like that was like this interesting stew of, I think, all these young people at this place, one of whom's got a father who was a preacher, and they're all kind of like trying to figure out who they are and what they believe and how to understand things. And like, this is like the cloud soup that surrounds them. I just think that's so interesting. I don't know if y'all think it's, I think it's super interesting.
I also, yeah, when you said it was like of an era, I was like, yes, there was a time where all these references in the book, again, trigger warning, was like, wow, it just depicted it so well for me. I want to make sure we have time for other questions, if that's okay. Do you all have questions?
Your voice is so different in your short story than your novel. Did you set out? Did the material necessitate, or did you grow into that change?
You know, you mean like the original version of the short story, or in general?
Yes, your other short stories are in more of a common genre. You
know, I think we should talk more, because I think you're the only person who thinks that, wrong. No, it doesn't mean you're wrong. It doesn't mean you're wrong. See, I'm not as good as Bart Ehrman. I am curious what it is you're picking up on, and I'm sure it may be something, but I think usually I hear that people feel the vibe, like. I'm very interested, because I think you clearly, like, there's something, and I don't know if maybe it's just like the longer form, or
that's the structure of your paragraphs and sentences.
Yeah.
And the complexity of them, I thought more.
Yeah.
Your psychological structure seemed about the same to me. Scary as hell.
Yeah. Very scary. Yeah, we'll have to discuss more, because whatever it is, I didn't set out to do it with intention. I'll say that, whatever you're picking up on. Yeah.
I really liked sort of the arc of how Joy talked about her parents at the beginning, and how you wrote about someone thinking of their parents, Leah's person, and then later the chapters about Joy's son, the person talking about her, and there were some differences, it seemed, in like I don't know how charitable maybe they were to their parents. So I was wondering, what you were thinking about, kind of really developing both of those.
Oh yeah, it's a good. I should be repeating questions, right? So Alice is asking about oh gosh, I'm not going to say it as well. The relationships of the characters, sort of when they're younger towards their parents, and then the way that like their kids see them and see their relationships with their parents. Yeah, I mean, I think that goes to my sense that, like, the fun of being a reader and the fun of fiction is like we get to have that experience of seeing it all, but like any given person is only locked into their own perception. I mean, I think it is that, I mean, I don't even want to dream of how far off I am, and like how I think of my own parents and how other people might, you know what I mean? Like, but I think it's like, it's so much easier to see in life when you are not emotionally invested in it. And so I think the fun to me of fiction is that you can create these little people and set them in motion, and you have emotional distance, so you can sort of like see all of the different angles on them that they themselves may not always be aware of. Did that answer your question? Other questions, or we can chit chat, or?
I had another question.
Yeah.
Oh, you have a question.
No, you go ahead.
Oh, okay. So we're both, correct me if I characterize this incorrectly, we're both sort of lapsed poets, at least currently.
I didn't know you were lapsed.
Well, we can talk more about
Okay.
that later. But we have this poetry background, like we're trained to write poetry. You include some poetry in the book, including the last page, I believe.
Yeah.
Is a poem that Carly has written, which I loved. Can you talk more about including that poem and then the poetry references throughout?
That is something I do a lot in short stories too. And there's something, so it must be something that's important to me. And I am sure it is a stand-in for something. I often have characters for whom poetry at some point in their life is very, very important. And they found very, very deeply moving and like deeply essential to their understanding of the world. And then like they've come to a place where they feel a little more distance from that, or they've lost touch with that. Yeah, I think, what do I think about that? I mean, I think maybe poetry it represents this thing that like at its best, it is a way that you tap into this kind of very, very beautiful, insightful, often elegantly, sort of succinctly crystallized something that understands the world. I mean, it is, I mean, I don't want to overly conflate it, but it's almost like there's a certain faith required with poetry. It's like I have to kind of like believe in it, and when I can like be in its thrall and believe in it, it's a really, really beautiful thing. But it's also something that I can get really disaffected with, and like in any sense, I think like it felt important with the themes of this book and what this character is sort of like looking to get back in touch with. It's something about her younger self and this younger self that like these younger selves that were kind of aching for the beauty of the world and like aching to experience that and aching to have a sense of purpose. And then that kind of collision with like the whole cold, hard realities of just like mundane grown-up life. And I'm not saying that poetry has to go away when you're like driving to the grocery store a lot, but I think there often is like a youth poetry thing. Yeah, so I wanted it to be in there as this like little glimpse or this little shared touchstone that both Joy and Carly had, this thing they kind of believed in. And I wanted to get these little like pieces. There are two poems that are Carly's poems. And then, do you want to know the like? I don't think I've ever told anybody this, but I'll tell you all of y'all a secret if you want to know. The other secret is like I just really love to not waste things, and I had these two poems, and I was like, I don't really ever plan to write poetry books again. I was like, you know, kind of, it's like I could give them to my characters. And one of them, I even like have the teacher comments on it and stuff. I like give them to my kid and I could use them. And like, how satisfying is that? I can just like stick them in here.
It's zero waste.
Yeah, zero waste living. So that's like the secret truth of, I also just wanted to do this.
Can you talk about the urban legend?
Yeah.
You're doing with that?
Yeah, I get asked that a lot. I kind of love, so this is, Rachel's asking about, there's an urban legend that appropriately kind of haunts the story, like, and you see it mentioned in some of the like interstitial stuff, but then also in a couple of the chapters. You know, what I was thinking about was that sense of like when something terrible happens, all the different ways that it spins out, that we're like this, you know, the void becomes the echo chamber. We're telling all these stories, trying to make sense of it. And like, to me, that's what's so interesting about urban legends. I think that's part of how they emerge. And so I thought like, of course there's gonna be an urban legend, and the urban legend is gonna like quasi-relate, maybe not to the case. And I actually experimented with making it, of all the things that you ultimately find out, it remains kind of a urban legend. Like it's not like, oh, at the end, Scooby-Doo, it was the person wearing a mask. Like I experimented with more resolution, but I felt that was corny. And then I felt like, you know what, I think that's the one piece. And I honestly, returning to it as a reader, I sort of think of it now as kind of like the threat of mortality. And I think that's how it's functioning in my mind, like returning to it a million times, like in the editorial process and thinking through it. It's like when I write it, it's all kind of like instinct. But yeah, I think I kind of, that's my theory of a lot of urban legends, actually. Like it goes, I think that it's our way of making stories out of like an amorphous fear of mortality. And so that's what I hope that is what I read it as doing, and that's what I sort of hope it is doing. You heard it here first.
One more question we have time for, I'm hearing.
So what is your next project?
I want to hear about the
Yeah,
memoir. You tell us first.
Yeah, I am sometimes still occasionally dabbling in poetry. My first book came out last year, called Radium Girl, which
Good, it's good.
thank you, I appreciate that. I sort of feel like I'm just sort of modeling my life off of Joanna, but instead of doing psychiatry, poetry, fiction, I'm doing psychiatry, poetry, nonfiction, because I'm my own person. So I'm very interested in lyric memoir, and so I'm working on a project towards that aim.
I can't wait for that. I think it's going to be beautiful, and Celeste, poetry is beautiful, and also what I've read of your essays, they're also beautiful. So I think we're in for a treat. I'm mostly trying to keep my head above water, but the closest thing I will be able to bring to completion will undoubtedly be another short story collection, which the sadness of my heart is that conventional publishing wisdom will tell you that the world's not as excited about. I buy them. I mean, I literally, like, I love short story collections. I get them everywhere, but yeah, so I hope to bring together a short story collection, hopefully relatively soon. I mean, I've got like 10 stories, which could work, but I often like 11 or 12. And then what I'm really hoping to do is get some traction on another longer project, maybe this fall, when I go on a little escape and have a couple of weeks away, and the magical is just like, wow. But yeah, thanks for asking that.
Final thoughts?
Thanks for coming, y'all. It's really kind for people to come to book events.
Yeah,
like
it's
the kindness does not go unnoted. So thank you.